Good morning, all. We can recall that in our lecture, in our study in chapter 11, we treated the British colonial conquest of Nigeria. In chapter 12, we looked at British administration in Nigeria, where we looked at the different administrative setup Britain had in colonial West Africa, which we described as Crown Colony, the Protectorate, and Trust Territory. In chapter 13, we considered the topic nationalism and the development of political parties in Nigeria. Today, chapter 14, we are going to look at Nigerian federalism. In today's lecture, we are going to know everything about federalism. Federalism, in its simplest definition, can mean a system of government where power is shared or distributed between the center and the regions or the states. Federalism in Nigeria is a British colonial heritage. It actually started with the amalgamation of the colony and protectorate of southern Nigeria and protectorate of northern Nigeria in 1914. In 1922, the Clifford Constitution that made provision for elective principle also in a way deepened the concept of federalism. But true federalism in Nigeria started with Authoritial Constitution of 1946. It was the Authoritial Constitution that deepened the concept of federalism in Nigeria. And we say that this concept, federalism, may mean different things to different people. But what appears to be constant about this political system is the intrinsic principle that distinguishes it from other systems. In this chapter, we shall examine the evolution or origin of federalism in Nigeria. We shall also discuss the factors that necessitated the adoption of federalism. We shall also evaluate the structures or features of federalism in Nigeria. We shall briefly consider the objectives. And we say that at the end of today's lecture, our students should be able to know the meaning of federalism. They will also account for its evolutionary process in Nigeria. Our students will also understand the factors that led to its adoption in Nigeria. And they will also know the structures and features of federalism. We want to know, briefly, discuss the meaning of federalism. And we said here that federalism may mean different things to different people. But what appears to be constant about this political system is the intrinsic principle that distinguishes it from other systems. This principle is called the federal principle, which is defined as the method of dividing powers so that the general and regional government are each within a sphere, coordinate and independent. What is meant by independent here is that each tier of government has its own independent functions and neither has supreme authority over the other. However, this view poses a problem of applicability because some measures of interdependence and cooperation are necessary for a successful operation of any given federal system. Now, we are going to look at some definitions. And Professor Tamuno looked at federalism as a form of government where the component units of a political organization participate in sharing powers and functions in cooperative manner. As a concept, the term federalism is traceable to the American political evolution. Federalism basically involves the combination of shared rule within a single political system so that no unit is subordinated to the other. Arguing persuasively with strong approvers, Watts asserts that the function of federation is not to eliminate internal differences, but rather to preserve regional identities within a united framework. Their function, therefore, is not to eliminate conflict, but to manage it in such a way that regional differences are accommodated. But how well this is done has in practice depended often upon the particular form of the institutions adopted within the federation. We are now going to look at the origin of federalism in Nigeria. And we say that Nigerian federalism started during her colonial experience with the British. The colonial administration, since the amalgamation of Northern and Southern protectorates in 1914 under a Governor General, Frederick Lugard, till the Lexington Constitution of 1954, treated Nigeria as a unitary country. Bernard Bodleian, as governor of Nigeria in 1939, divided Nigeria into three: the Western, Eastern, and Northern provinces. So the Nigerian federalism has its origin with the division of the country into three by Governor Bodleian. The groundwork or foundation for Nigerian federalism was further consolidated following the introduction of the principle of regionalism and the retention of the three regions in the Richard's Constitution of 1946. A better foundation for the development of federalism in Nigeria was laid by the Macpherson Constitution of 1951, following the introduction of quasi-federalism for the country. In all this, however, ultimate power still resided in the central government, and the regional councils, legislative and executive, still remained largely mere advisory bodies to the central administration. It was the Lexington Constitution of 1954 that fully introduced a federal system into the administration of Nigeria by devolving considerable power on the regional administrations, who could formulate policies and execute programs of their own. The central government then focused on an exclusive list, nationally important matters like defense, external affairs, customs, and currency. The Independence Constitution of 1960 worked on the federal structure, with more powers to the regional government. The military government under General Yakubu Gowon in 1967 created 12 states, shifting the focus on divisions from regions to states. This continued under the 1979 Constitution with 19 states, and the 1989 Constitution with 30 states, and the 1999 Constitution with 36 states, which gave greater autonomy and prominence to local government. In a federalism or federal system, authority and powers are shared into one exclusive list, and in exclusive list, it contains all powers and functions in the exclusive list, which are excised by the federal government only. Some of the items in the exclusive list include currency, defense, external affairs, aviation, immigration, customs, mining, and others. Number 2, the concurrent list. All the powers and functions in the concurrent list are excised by the federal and state government at the same time. Items which usually appear in the concurrent list include health, education, roads, communications, and others. In the event of any conflict or disagreement in the exercise of concurrent power, the decision of the federal government will override that of the state government to the extent of the inconsistency or conflict. The number 3 is what we call residual list. The powers and functions in the residual list are only exercised by the state or regional government. Items of the residual list include those items which are neither in the exclusive nor in the concurrent list. Example, chieftaincy affairs and others. We are now going to look at the factors that necessitated the adoption of federalism in Nigeria. And one of the factors is what we call cultural differences. And we say that the country was made up of people of different ethnic groups, religions, customs, traditions, and languages. The people thus opted for federalism to retain as much as possible of their identity. Similarly, these diversities created problems for the running of a unitary system. Point number 2, the size of Nigeria. The country was too large, both territorially and in population, for a unitary system of government, and federalism thus became inevitable for administrative convenience. Point number 3 is economic factor. In Nigeria, natural resources are scattered. Therefore, component units must unite as a federation to harness the resources for their overall benefit, in addition to even and rapid development. Point number 4, the desire for unity. The desire for unity of groups within Nigeria, where one will not be disenchanted with another that was controlling the center, necessitated the adoption of federalism in Nigeria. Point number 5, the desire of the British. The desire of the British was to preserve the unity of the country. The British were not interested in the disintegration of Nigeria, and therefore encouraged the division of the country into 3 regions, each with some autonomy from the central government. Point number 6 is security. The need for internal security and protection from external aggression necessitated the coming together of the component units into a federation. The units together as a federation will be stronger and more stable than individual units. We are now going to look at or consider the features of Nigerian federalism. What are the features or characteristics of Nigerian federalism? Number 1, the constitutions have been dividing powers between the federal government and the component units, formerly called regions, and now states and local government. 2, in all the constitutions, the central government has been supreme with exclusive powers on many subjects and final authority on some others. 3, there has been in the existence of a multi-party system, except the 1989 constitution that stipulated a 2-party system. 4, there has been a bicameral legislation of one form or another. 5, there has been the supremacy of the constitution from which all the various levels of government drive their powers. 6, the Supreme Court gives judicial interpretations of the constitution. 7, constitutional conferences usually take place to consult the people towards modifying the constitution. 8, secession by any section of the federation is constitutionally forbidden. Having seen the features of federalism in Nigeria, we are now going to look at the problems of Nigerian federalism. And number 1 is the problem of revenue allocation. It is usually a difficult problem on how to find an acceptable formula for sharing the federally collectible revenue in a federal state. In Nigeria, for instance, the problem is usually whether the principle of derivation, needs, national interest, school enrollment, and landmass should be used as a basis for working out an acceptable revenue allocation formula for the country. 2. The minority issue. In most federal states, there are minority groups which often complain of being dominated in the scheme of things by the majority groups. For instance, Nigeria is a multi-nation state which has several heterogeneous ethnic groups. Point number 3, the problem of creation of some states. In Nigeria, for example, there have been constant agitation for creation of more states among the different ethnic groups. The major ethnic groups, for instance, want more states to be created out of their present ones, while the minority groups want a separate state of their own. Thus, the issue of creation of more states is a problem in Nigeria. Point number 4, the problem of ethnicity or rivalry and tribalism. In most federal states, there are often strong and fierce competition among the dominant and minority ethnic groups for control of the political power at the center and in the sharing of the federal post and other amenities. Point number 5, the problem or issue of secession. Most federal states are threatened by the problem of secession from the component units. Sometimes the component unit in federal system may decide to secede for one reason or the other. Point number 6, boundary disputes. Component units having common boundaries are usually in conflict with one another. Point number 7, conflict over matters on the concurrent list. Conflicts usually arise between the central and component units over matters on the concurrent list. Because of the rigid nature, that is point number 8, because of the rigid nature of the Constitution, adaptation to changing circumstances is not always easy. And the last point, dual loyalty. The problem of dual loyalty or statism can also create problems in federal system of government. Now, having looked at the problems associated with federalism in Nigeria, the next thing we are going to consider is what should our leaders do to make federalism work in Nigeria. And we say for federalism to work effectively in Nigeria, the following suggestions are recommended. 1, a quick constitutional reform should be carried out to resolve certain problems inherent in the operation of federalism in Nigeria. 2, all traits of unitary system of government should be expunged from Nigeria's federal system and states should be given the degree of freedom and autonomy they deserve. Point number 3, political education and enlightenment of the citizens should be encouraged in order to propagate the good virtues of federalism, both in practice and in theory. Point number 5, economic performance and the reduction of poverty must be the prime basis for reviewing the structures of the federation. Point number 6, therefore, additional decentralization measures must be carried out to promote innovation and healthy competitions among the states for productive activities. And finally, the leadership needs to practice and uphold fairness and responsibility in government affairs. This is where we will end today's lecture. Next week, we shall consider chapter 15 with the title Nigeria since independence. Thank you.